am going to be talking about the first of a group of horror novels that I'm reading that are a little bit lesser known than some of the big mainstream ones that people would probably be very, very familiar with. Some of these actually have had movies made of them. One in particular, I had no clue that there was a book that went along with the movie because the movie had some notoriety in the horror movie world of being very good, but I had no idea that there was a book that it was taken from. So we're going through some sort of more obscure horror novels that I have gotten from some different places. Outlaw Bookseller was the one who initially made this sort of book list that he made a video of, and I'm going to be reading some of them here and reviewing them. The first one that I finished is the one that interests me probably the most out there. That's why I read it first, and it's called The Case Against Satan by Ray Russell. This book, and see if this story sounds familiar. This book is about a family, a single parent and their child that go to a priest because the child has been acting oddly. She will not go to mass any longer. She is having very vile outbursts. She is saying things and doing things and hurting herself and other people. And the parent believes that something is going on and takes her to a priest. The priest pretty quickly determines that he believes that she is possibly something going on with her, and he doesn't contact, but the bishop comes in, and these two men determine that she is probably possessed. They begin to have an exorcism of her that sort of starts to spiral wildly out of control. As it spirals wildly out of control, the priest and the bishop continue to argue with each other about many existential things and what's happening and trying to figure out what is going on with this girl. And they kind of have their own crises. The priest has his own crises. He is a bit troubled, this priest, and he is having his own trial of faith as this is going on. Eventually, they do determine that she appears to have a demon, and ultimately it kind of ends up with the demon being cast out of her at the end, and somebody does die at the end. Now, this sounds very, very familiar. If you are aware of horror novels and horror movies, this sounds like I have picked up a book that is just rehashing The Exorcist. The issue is this book is 10 years prior to William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist. This is a precursor, actually. This was written back in the early 60s, so it has kind of a 50s feel to it, more than Blatty's. Now, that being said, I do not see how Blatty was not familiar with this book. There are too many beats that are stunningly similar. The book, and I'll start to be a little more specific about it. The book focuses on Gregory, who is a priest. He is a troubled priest. He's got issues because he is a drunk, or has had issues with drinking. And that has sort of followed him to his new parish. He has been moved to this new parish because the priest that he is replacing had a very unpleasant situation with this girl. Now, that Gregory does not know that when he goes in, and is sort of, that kind of plays into things later on. the priest that had the interaction with this girl. She is older than the Exorcist. This girl is 16. So there are a few more things that are sort of thrown around here in a way that they might not have been in The Exorcist. And as the book gets down towards the end, it's a little more of a police procedural. There's a little more of a mystery with an actual conclusion. There's a little more of a vagueness. Not much of one, but there is a vagueness. Just a faint hint that this girl might have faked it. That perhaps this could have been a psychosomatic thing with her, whereas in The Exorcist, it's very, very clear that it is a supernatural thing from the get-go. The case against Satan, perhaps not. It has more to do with Gregory's determination about whether he thinks the devil is real or not. It has a lot to do with that, and him coming to terms with his faith and his belief system. And there is a crime that has involved this girl, actually two sort of crimes that have involved this girl, that would have caused her to have sort of a mental break. And he acknowledges that, but by the end of the book, he does kind of determine that he can't explain some of these things, which he could explain some of these things kind of vaguely with science, but he feels that the supernatural explanation is the one he's going to believe. It's a very different novel in that aspect. It's toned down in this way, whereas Blatty with The Exorcist really goes over the top. He goes through basically trying to hit shock value on everything. The movie hits shock value on everything that it can. This is a much more spare version of that. What they describe, you do get the impression of exorcism going on and what's happening. You don't get the very, very detailed explanation of what's being said and what she's doing and all these things. Now, there is a throwing up scene, which seems a little bit, once again, very, very similar to The Exorcist in what happens and how it kind of goes about. So which is why I'm saying I cannot see how he was not familiar with this book. Very familiar with this book. But the the priest and the bishop are basically, they have very sort of very different outlooks on religion. The priest, he is much more scientific based. That's one of the big things with him. He has written some articles that were a little controversial. And the bishop is kind of old-fashioned. He tries to keep an open mind, but he is very much along the lines of your typical conservative way of thinking about all these sort of things. Because this book is so short, the characters are not particularly fleshed out in a way that The Exorcist may have been. The girl, Susan, she is not really fleshed out as a character in a huge amount. She's just sort of there. The minute you meet her, there's a problem. So it's not like The Exorcist where you're kind of living with this family, this mother and daughter. There's also the issue that the parent is the father. It's not a mother. The mother has died. And all of this kind of features into the big problem, which is why I was actually kind of able to figure out what was going on way before they even sort of hinted at what was probably going on in the situation. Just because I guess in the 60s and the 50s, this might have been more of a shocking thing that comes about at the end. But to me, I sort of saw, as a modern reader, sort of saw where that was going immediately here with this situation that had happened. So Susan is not really, she's older, so there is more of an aspect that she's not the innocent little girl that you have with Reagan in The Exorcist. She is a little bit older. I actually think that works better. I kind of like the toned downness that The Case Against Satan has, as opposed to the complete over the top that The Exorcist is. There's some really, really good points that are made in here too, when the priest and the bishop are sort of arguing with each other about religion and about different kind of beliefs about Satan in general, because they were talking about how God may have been easy to believe in, but Satan, with this whole sort of way that we look at him as this sort of caricature, that's a little bit harder to believe in. And because of that, that is the book is kind of, that is the title, and that is kind of the idea. It's the case against him. It's the case of is there a Satan? Is there a ultimate evil that they kind of go into? And they look at this very, very kind of like very almost theologically in some way, and they make some good points. Just in a horror novel, some good points are made at several different intervals in the book, when they were talking about, well, maybe that we look at it this way because of, a certain thing. Maybe it's what we call mental illness now is not necessarily any different than what it would have been. Maybe it's still part of something that is ultimately evil, and maybe the fact that there is some more understanding in psychoanalysis and things like that kind of lets the door open for certain situations where it's not necessarily psychoanalysis, and there is a possibility that it is a supernatural situation rather than a psychological one. And because of the reliance on psychology, perhaps that has left the door open a little bit for Satan himself to kind of be able to slide on in there, because no one's looking for him anymore. And there's kind of a little bit of a spin on some of that, and then it's an interesting sort of thing that perhaps our reliance on science has, because we've ignored Satan so much, the reliance on science has allowed him to do a thing or two. So it's an interesting argument, and it's an interesting point to kind of say that, well, that is a good point to at least argue in a supernatural way that kind of doesn't denegate science, but also is saying, you can have both. Both things can be going on, perhaps. So this is, like I said, this is a very good book. This is The Exorcist for people who don't want to be horrified out by The Exorcist. It's a good, I would even say it's for people who don't like horror. In this case, there is a lot of stuff going on, but it is in such a kind of clean-cut way that the horror doesn't have much different from if you were reading a thriller or if you were reading a mystery. And that is an interesting feature, but this is kind of The Exorcist for beginners, because this is definitely almost the same plot. This is almost the same plot, and I don't, like I said, I don't see how Blatty was not aware of this book. There is no way. There are too many similarities with these two things. And I kind of like this one. I kind of like the not over-the-topness, the not showiness of this one, and kind of the conclusion that there isn't some answers to some things, but there's not necessarily some answers to some other things. And that sort of leaves it open to interpretation to the reader. So I would very much suggest this book, The Case Against Satan by Ray Russell. So that is my first one on some kind of unusual horror that is not as well known.